Good evening, and thanks to the T.G Jacob committee for inviting me. When I was asked if I could come for delivering this lecture, I wondered why me. Then I remembered I actually had occasion to spend a day and a half with T.G Jacob many years ago. This must have been in the 1990s. This was the height of the Sri Lankan Civil War, and a group had broken off from the CPM at that time and formed the Tamil National Communist Party. And they were very interested in exploring questions to do with the self-determination of nations along with socialism. So S.V. Rajadurai, who was at that time very active in these circles, he arranged for a meeting of various groups that were interested in this question, and T.G. Jacob was with us for 1.5 days, and I was a translator at that time. And Rajadurai and I were working on the Tamil non-Brahmin movement on Periyar. So it was quite an interesting discussion that we had, and it was clear, I think Jacob had already published his book on Punjab by then. This must have been 94 or 95, I think the book came out in 91. So it was quite interesting to think about these matters from a broad left perspective, which was not a defined party perspective yet. So we had a range of discussions on many matters, and I think some of those issues that we discussed many years ago, 35 years ago, how do you criticize the social, provide a critique of the social totality that looks at specific histories and trajectories of change and does not work only formally from theory. K. Balgopal used to make this joke every time he spoke about Indian theorizing in the communist context. He said when Lenin spoke of Russian agriculture, he started with Russia, we start with Lenin. So, and Jacob said similar things in his own manner. So the importance of situating it within recognizable realities that are part of our immediate context, and then using a socialist analytic lens to come out with the definition of the social totality. That was one of the things that Jacob insisted on at that time. And the importance of the caste order in understanding our realities. Caste not simply as a matter of whether it should be seen as part of the base or the superstructure, but caste as central to both production relations as well as to ideological defenses of inequality. So that's something also that was spoken of at that time. And very important for Jacob and for the Tamil National Communist Party at that time, the question of self-determination. And various states within the Indian Union, how do we situate their relationship to a unitary state, and also what should be the nature of any socialist republic, and what would be the question of nationalities within the republic. These were matters that were widely discussed, and I think these issues are still with us in some ways. And Jacob would add on other things to them, especially the developmentalist trajectory of the Indian state and its effects on the environment. These were matters he would write off later. So in a sense, if you are talking about Hindu communalism today and the Indian left, we are invoking Jacob's memory in more than one manner, I think. So, and roughly my presentation will also sort of touch on some of these issues. But I will confess that trying to put this lecture together was not easy, because I didn't know where to start. First of all, how does one talk of the Indian left as such? Because there have been so many tendencies, different kinds of parties. There are individuals who are not associated with parties but who see themselves as leftists. People who are part of civil forums. So it was quite difficult to actually assemble a range of ideas or opinions. But I decided that I can't be, of course, encyclopedic. I will do something very modest. So I decided to take 3 approaches. One is that I will look at such official documents that are available in the public domain, which have been put out by various shades of the left, CPM for one, CPIML Liberation, Red Star, the Maoists, whatever material is currently available to us, and individual writers who have been writing steadily. K. Murli is here, J.R.S. Banaji, and some leftist writers from Tamil Nadu, for example, like Comrade Tyagu, who has been active in both national liberation struggles and who is a translator of Capital into Tamil. So he is an interesting figure, and he continues to lecture and talk on a number of these issues. So some individual thinkers and so on, and see what do we have in terms of how is Hindu communalism conceptualized. That's at one level. The second level is what can we learn from the history of the Indian left, such as it has emerged from late colonial times. What does it have to teach us? Thirdly, in terms of what the different constituents of the left have held up as important in our fight against Hindu communalism. And here I shall draw largely from what I know from Tamil Nadu, and I'm sure in the discussion we can expand that argument to other states. So this is roughly what I wish to talk about. So very quickly, I won't go into the details of all these policies and documents that are there. They are all in the public domain. But basically, I just want to index what is it that most of them say. So one thing everybody is agreed on, whether it is the parliamentary left or different constituents of the Marxist-Leninist groups, that this whole Hindu communalism and the Hindu Rashtra that the Hindu right wants to construct, and the remaking of the Indian state to that purpose, that is clearly spearheaded by the RSS. It's part of their long engagement with Indian polity and society. And it is not an accident that this has come to maturity in the time of neoliberalism. That is also something almost everybody agrees on. And by neoliberalism, people have used different yardsticks to measure it, but 2 or 3 factors are part of many such definitions, where you see intensification of what would appear to be a superseded stage, primitive accumulation, which you see in areas where Adivasis have lived for several centuries, financialization of capital, and also the state as a purveyor of capitalism. How do you describe this? Bureaucratic capitalism, state capitalism. So these appear to be the definitional similarities between various groups in their understanding of neoliberalism. And the question is, why does neoliberalism need this version of Hindutva? And how may we understand that relationship? That is something also that is on everybody's mind. And many of you also know this endless argument about whether this is fascism, neo-fascism, does the polity exhibit fascist tendencies, how do you describe it? And some of the terms which I found interesting and which feature in all documents, including that of the CPM, is that Brahmanical fascism, Manuvadi Brahmanical rule, communal fascism, Manuvadi Hindu fascism. So these are all terms that are there in almost all documents. RSS Manuvadi fascism. And the term RSS and Manuvadi are brought together in fairly explicit ways in most documents. So clearly there is a sense of this being situated in a distinctive and long existing social vision also of the Hindu right, as also the neoliberal conjuncture. So this is something again you defined in all the documents. And importantly, how does this manifest itself? Again, I don't have to go on, we all know how it manifests itself. One is of course the way the state is interfering in the functioning of democratic institutions with the apparatuses of the state itself, whether it's the judiciary or parliament or the executive, and the targeted violence trained against Muslims, and I'll come back to that later in the talk, and polarizing the polity whenever there's an opportunity to do so, and fracturing civil society at various levels through a mixture of coercion and inducements. So these are features that everybody marks as typical of this moment in history. And how might one challenge that? Again, almost all parties distinguish between tactical approaches and strategic approaches, with tactical approaches being defined by having a broad front against communalism. And again, interestingly, much of this was spelled out before the current elections, the recently concluded elections. So these are, that's the broad front, and also how might one also retain a critique of the political system of various political parties, including those who are part of an alliance, and how does one then work against Hindu communal fascism in keeping with a broad vision of socialist liberation, emancipation and so on. So this is roughly what you have, and reading this several times over and over, I found 2 things very important. One is that to characterize the state in terms of Brahmanical ideology is relatively new in the Indian context. Jacob, when he was writing in Marsline, referenced that, and well after he stopped being an editor. And I think there have been some tendencies which have called attention to the very distinctive Hindu Brahmanical character of the Indian state for a while now. but more generally that has not been a term favored by all constituents of the left until recently. And while talking about Hindu Brahmanical character of the state, inevitably most documents and writers reference Ambedkar and his understanding of the Hindu social order. This to me also was an important shift in the ways we think about our social totality. I'll come back to these terms and how they have been used, but I think these are also parts of our attempt to think about fascism here in ways that are not given by the fascisms we know from Europe. And I think all parties are agreed that we need to also rethink this in terms of our own historical experiences. And the term Manuvadi, Brahmanism, patriarchy, all of these figure in the descriptions of the state that is presiding over the communal agenda today. So this is something that you get from the documents, but it is my submission that we need to really think through how these terms sit in these documents. How are they being used? What is their substantive content? Is there substantive content? Is there more that we need to do with these terms? So this is something that I will come back to. Likewise with our understanding of neoliberalism, while we've all sort of perhaps know intuitively that this is a different moment, how may we understand neoliberalism beyond such descriptions that we have? And thirdly, how would we sort of also understand our own responses as part of broad, progressive, perhaps socialist minded forces? How do we assess our own responses? So these are the things that I want to address next. So, and here I think the turn to history is useful. While there's a lot that needs to be said about the engagement of the Indian left with religion, religiosity, religious consciousness and so on, I won't have time to go into the details of everything, but I just want to point out to some issues because I think they continue to matter for our understanding of religion, especially those from the left. So one is of course, I want us to go back to the Moplah Revolt since this is Kerala, and one of the interesting things that you find is the way sort of emergent Indian left, when the revolt happened there was no organized Indian left as such, but such as it emerged later on in the 20s, its understanding of the Moplah Revolt was very interesting. People of course said many things about it in retrospect when interviewed in the 60s and 70s, but at that moment, whether it is Dange and other people, what you get is a sense of that this is pre-political consciousness and they are not quite sure how to understand it, but soon as they get into the sense of that we are going to be part of an emergent socialist politics, they see it as a pre-political consciousness of an oppressed group which still doesn't have the language of class but which has used a religious idiom to express itself. This is the first level of understanding of the relationship between religion and politics that you find from the early documents of the Communist Party. Then of course they have to reckon with this whole thing of Hindu-Muslim violence throughout from the late 20s. And that then again it's interesting. So is this pre-political consciousness, does it have only liberative aspects or is it also a stifling consciousness? Will it divide the working class? And here again you find the most detailed statement in the Meerut conspiracy case arguments, and where you find some very interesting expressions. Basically that the kind of communal tensions that you see building up between workers, and the examples are drawn largely from strikes in Bombay, in Calcutta and so on, and much of it is located outside the working class itself, that the working class left to itself will not sort of give in to caste or religious consciousness. It's a work of outsiders. Outsiders could be mill owners, factory owners, it could be the colonial state which through its agent provocators is instilling this kind of a toxic religious sentiment amongst the workers. So these are matters that are also discussed in the literature of that time. So you see a kind of a very interesting veering between seeing the presence of religious consciousness and caste consciousness amongst workers and not willing to admit that they are yet to become a class for themselves in the substantive sense of the term. And so religious consciousness and caste consciousness are sort of relegated to the outside, to what one can say is a kind of a space from where there are forces acting on the workers and misleading them and dividing them. So this is something that you find sort of being discussed through the 20s and 30s and well into the 40s in fact, in some ways. Now the other thing is of course contrast this with the practice of the left. That is very interesting because if you read accounts of local struggles through the 30s and 40s, no, the communist constituents are not averse to using such idioms from folk religion or extant religious sort of ideologies that speak of justice. You see that happening in many places. For example, if you look at East Bengal and the organization of the Muslim peasantry, they draw upon an idiom of Islamic millenarianism. And so there is that element of religious consciousness and class struggle coming together, which of course then raises further questions. Will the Hindu working class be part of such a world then? And then you find similar things done in a different way during the Tebaga struggle in Bengal, where you have local traditions of Vaishnavism or Sufi Islam being drawn into mobilization. So it is in practice, it's whatever cultures of opposition or resistance are there, left parties, left organizers have either organically drawn from them or instrumentally drawn from them, depending on how it was done. So religion does figure in a major way in organizing also in some very, as you can see. And for me, one of the most interesting descriptions of this is in this very interesting novel on Tebaga by Sabitri Ray called Harvest Song, where she talks of different religious influences along with secular socialist influences coming together in that moment of struggle in Bengal, undivided Bengal. So you have this situation where religion cannot be wished away. Religion is part of the world of the working class, whether in rural India or in urban India. Religious forms, folk religiosity, all these are part of how you express, class anger or class violence even sometimes. But yet, at the theoretical level, it is not clear how one can think of religion. Is it something the working class has already transcended or has it not transcended it? And in Tamil Nadu, of course, this was interesting because of the association the leading left leader of that time, M. Singaravelu, had with the self-respect movement. So he took an unapologetic anti-religious line throughout and an anti-Brahmanical line throughout, right from the late 30s onwards in his writings. Though he adhered to a broad socialist framework and didn't go with the broad non-Brahmin movement, but he brought a different edge to that whole thing. So again, we need to think of how different regions work with this idiom. But the thing is, this history is very interesting because it shows us that this matter continues to bedevil us in so many different ways. How do we work with it? What do we do with this? And so on. And I think one moment of importance in this whole thing was, of course, the Pakistan question. We're all familiar with that resolution to support the demand for Pakistan after 1940 by the communist theorists. But then again, you will see that it comes at a time when the Comintern itself has moved from a united front strategy to a anti-imperialist strategy. From 1934 to 1941, there is a shift, which means that as part of this broad anti-imperialism, there is this whole impetus to invite Muslims into the anti-colonial resistance from a socialist point of view. So you have that whole sort of movement towards Pakistan, and we must also remember that the Communist Party granted the right of self-determination but not necessarily to secession. That's also an important thing. So when the demand for Pakistan was put forth, they spent a lot of time trying to talk about the importance of a coalition government, of the Congress and the League to working together, of the right of nationalities to determine their own fates, and dividing India up into 17 units, 17 federal units. So a lot of work was done at that time as well. But again, I think the whole question of Muslim representation was seen with skeptical eyes. The demands of the Muslim League for a specific kind of representation was seen as a diversion. So that's also part of the legacy with which we have to confront the present. And I think one of the most intriguing responses from that time is during the Telangana movement in the Deccan, where we all know the Telangana movement and the kind of repression it faced, both from the Nizam's government and subsequently from Nehru's government. We know that history. Now we also know that there was this police action against the state of Hyderabad, and one of the things that has been successfully banished from national memory is the violence done unto Muslim citizens, which is now being written about and spoken about at great length. A lot of work has been published. And the Communist Party, while it condemned the violence, you also see that it struggles with this whole, this sort of, national is equal to secular and minority is equal to communal. So you find them struggling with that formulation. Even Sundaraya's text, if you go back and read the Telangana thing, On the one hand, it's completely understandable given the fact that they were fighting against the Nizam and his feudatories. But Nizam and his feudatories ceased to be only social, economic actors and become Muslim actors also at that time. So there's a kind of a slip between seeing them as class enemies and caste enemies and seeing them also as a religious, bestowing a religious identity on them. So it is not that this is consistently done, but you see that there is a tension. Historically, this is the situation that we have inherited from the United Communist Party of India, the CPI. And subsequently also you see this being played out in today's politics in many ways. How do you characterize, say, independent Muslim political organizing? The IUML is a separate matter because it goes back to pre-colonial times and so on. But such organizations that emerge later on, like the Majlis, Owaisi's Majlis in Hyderabad, or in our own part SDPI, for example, and earlier Jamaat-e-Islami in the different parts of the country. And the fact that Muslim organizations had to practice a politics of censorship with the coming of independence. This has been documented for Tamil Nadu, which is interesting because the Muslim League in Tamil Nadu has always seen itself, or Muslim political constituencies have seen themselves as part of a broad Dravidian sort of political culture, and they have consistently voted for the Dravidian parties more or less. But in the years following the police action, they all had to downplay their own Islamic character, so to speak, and also distance themselves from this whole demand for Dravida Nadu, because that could be seen as potentially secessionist. And if you are Muslim and you are supporting Dravida Nadu, it becomes a double layer of alienation in some ways. So you find that tension being played out in different ways, and the left parties that are there don't squarely face up to it in ways that could have opened up the debate in many other directions, till the ML parties took up the issue of self-determination again in the 60s and 70s. But even then, I think the specificity of the Muslim question was not addressed with the gravity it deserved, at least we can talk about this later at discussion time. And today, I think more than ever, this has become a very important issue for various reasons, as we all know. I don't have to go into the details, but I think conceptually what we find happening before our eyes, and this is something I discussed with the historian Uma Chakravarti, and I said, don't you see, she said, don't you see, we are seeing the making of a new untouchable class. The logic is very similar, not that we have given up on existing forms of untouchability, but this conjuncture, this neoliberal Hindu communal conjuncture seems to need a new sort of limit to what it considers the Hindu society. And that new limit is being set by excluding Muslims in ways that Dalits were excluded in the past. Spatial segregation, economic boycott, social violence, and then of course drawing on an extremely gendered rhetoric. And we all know this from the love jihad arguments that they put forth when they started out in 2014 and so on. But also this continuing sort of assertion by Hindutva hoodlums, whether they are Bajrang Dal or whoever it is on the ground, this whole thing about how Muslims are very fertile people, that their numbers will overwhelm the Hindu numbers, which then becomes a very gendered argument about the insatiable fertility of the Muslim woman, which was a sort of subject of many leaflets distributed during the Gujarat violence, because many feminist fact-finding teams pointed that out, that Muslims are very fertile for two reasons. Muslim women's wombs are more fertile than Hindu women's wombs, and Muslim men have a greater sexual urge than Hindu men, which makes them potential assaulters. So these were, and there was some really terrible, horrible folk sort of rhymes that were circulated about the insatiable sexual precocity of Muslim men at that time. So I think you see this very gendered logic also built into this othering, and that is something that again goes back to pre-colonial time, late colonial times, because one of the reasons that organizations like the Hindu Mahasabha and the Arya Samaj start organizing Hindus, so to speak, is this fear of the Muslims overtaking Hindus demographically. They go by the 1911 census to argue their case. So this has a very long history also, and the historian Charugupta has written about the repercussions of that in the United Provinces of that time. So you have this sort of, this othering of Muslims that you see is also somewhere to completely sort of render that population distinct from what is national, what is society, what is within the limits of sociality itself. So in this context, it becomes very important that we revisit the Indian left's engagement, not simply with the question of religion, but its very not inconsistent, but it's fairly complicated and not very clear engagement with the question of Muslim rights in the Indian context. How has that been in the past prior to Hindutva, and how does it still play out in the current responses of various left actors to the Muslim question? This is something we can think about. That's one thing I want to sort of put here. The second thing is, why is this being done? And I think Murli has raised this question, why this particular form of Hindutva, this savage Hindutva that we see now? Why is it needed at this point in time? And I think here is when we need to also perhaps revisit our debates on neoliberalism. How do we understand neoliberalism? And correct me if I'm wrong later on during discussions, but I think one of the things that perhaps we miss in many of the left formulations is a dialectical understanding of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is seen largely in terms of what it has achieved and succeeded in doing. And when we talk of responses, we think of particular protests, whether it is the Kisan movement or whether it is particular protests in particular parts of the country. And so such protests continue to take place. We know that. In Odisha, it continues to take place. It took place in the Kalinganagar. It took place during the struggle against the Korean steel companies that came there, against Vedanta. So such struggles continue to take place. But more generally, perhaps we need to also pay attention to what has happened to the Hindu caste order in relationship to developmental change over the last so many decades. And that is an important question, because Hindu social order has also got unsettled in many ways because of various kinds of developmental changes, whether it has to do with industrial expansion, changes in agriculture, the role of the government in anti-poverty measures, and the pull of the global market in drawing migrant workers, which has a long history again. The Indian labor diaspora goes back to the 19th century, again during the high age of imperialism. So I think what has this done to our society? What are the dialectical changes that we can identify in what Gramsci characterizes as the organic movement of history as opposed to the occasional movement of history? So when we talk of particular protests, we are talking about occasional movements. But when we talk of long-term shifts, what are these shifts? How may we understand them? And I just want to look at very briefly at two things. One is this very important study by the historian Prem Chowdhury. She's from Haryana, and she's looked at 100 years of change in that part of the country from the 1890s to the 1980s. And it's called, the book is called The Veiled Woman, and basically she's looked at what has happened to agriculture in that region, and how has it unsettled both family relationships amongst the Jat peasantry and the Dalits, and how has it also unsettled the relationship between caste-defined occupation and the value of labor. How have these things changed? And it's quite interesting what she points out. There has been mobility, especially after the Green Revolution to some extent. There has been a shift in how Jat women who earlier used to work outside have been pulled into the household, given notions of Jat respectability after some sections amongst the Jat peasantry have acquired land and see themselves as part of a landlord class, and how such values also then are transmitted to Dalit agricultural laborers, to Mazhabi Sikhs as well, who have never had these values in the past, because their lives also improved to a certain extent with better wages and so on, and some of them do acquire little bits of land. And so you see a sequestering of women's lives, while at the same time the insistence that Dalit women should labor also. Sequestering in a sexual conjugal sense, but being available as labor in a public sense. So it makes for some very interesting shifts, and therefore what happens to a society's sense of itself. So likewise, if you start looking at Haryana afterwards, and that study has been done by the sociologist Surinder Jotka, and he points out what has happened in places like Haryana. How have Dalit and lower caste communities become more mobile, more aspirational? How does this play out in the social realm, the violence against Dalit women, especially Dalit girl students who go to study? So how may we understand the changes that the neoliberal movement has brought about, which it's a continuation in some ways of the Green Revolution in terms of how the rural economy has been unsettled, but also new changes, migration, going away to other places, the cash economy, getting out of agrarian labor and into other kinds of urban labor. While it may not have reduced inequalities to any significant extent, it has still made for a certain mobility and a certain expansion of what one wants for oneself, one's community and so on. And I think this shift hasn't been fully understood or mapped. And I say this because whenever we talk of what has happened in the neoliberal era, we talk of the BJP co-opting the lower OBCs or the minority OBCs along with the minorities amongst the Dalits. We see this as an electoral strategy. And of course, empirically this can be proved also in different instances. But perhaps going beyond this language of co-optation, can we think of some of these communities and classes that are emerging, we don't quite know how to characterize them, that they are also responding to this conjuncture in some ways. And their choice to either vote or not vote for this or that party also has to do with their sense of where they stand in the historical moment. And I think that is an important thing to note because the caste order is being unsettled. And obviously the violence that you see, say in Hathras for example, or in other parts, is the violence say that Balagopal documented for the Andhra countryside in the 80s and 90s at the height of the People's War movement there. And that unsettling had been caused by the organizing of the People's War and all the work that happened there in the 80s and 90s. So whether it is Karam Chedu or Chunduru, that unsettling has to do with a wider democratization that had taken place. And they were fighting back, and then you sort of have the Congress on the one hand trying to co-opt them, you have the left still organizing them, you also have the emergence of independent Dalit organizations later on in the 90s. So the point is that the neoliberal era must also perhaps be seen not just presided over predatory capital, imperialist, global capital's own desire to garner profits through financialization of capital, but also it is also something that is being met from below. And in that interaction, what is happening? How do we think of the neoliberal movement as more conflictual beyond specific struggles? That there is a sense of conflict that is emerging perhaps. We don't know what it is and how may we map it, how may we think about it. Because I think that organic movement of history is important for us to grasp also. In case, if we want to sort of come to this relationship between Hindutva and the neoliberal regime from that angle. And once we come to it from that angle, we see that more needs to be done in terms of addressing the kind of political trajectories that have emerged over the last 20-25 years and how might we understand that. And this is important because if you take the states, say a state like Tamil Nadu or even Andhra, Telangana for that matter, you will see that this assertion in an economic sense of communities that were earlier socially and educationally backward, all the BCs and OBCs as Mandal calls them, you will see that that assertion today is very much what the Tamil Nadu government presents as a success of the Dravidian model. It's these communities that have succeeded in many different ways, not equally. There's still levels of inequality. There are still class divisions even within those communities which are better situated than other communities. But you also see a very dynamic economy and polity that has been, that has emerged. So I think one needs to therefore conceptualize this also beyond the language of just this kind of violence of this moment of capital. No doubt it's violent, but there are also lots of changes and shifts of which we know far too little, I think, in a detailed empirical sense. And it perhaps is useful to assemble and look across states to see what is happening, how is it being played out, how might we rethink the neoliberal moment, can we think of some of these actors, OBC actors or particular Dalit groups as responding from within this, political changes in the political economy, changes in social relations. Can one then sort of put forth a more creative, a more fraternal way of thinking about these changes? This is something also I think that's important. So that then brings me to the question of the state, because right now we see the state in conjunction with capital and everybody else is on this side. Now the whole question of the state, as we all know, the modern state is distinguished from all other states in being at least formally a democratic state, but retaining its monopoly over violence. And that is its most very simple defining characteristic apart from various differences that states have. And today in the Indian context, you have a situation where over years, starting from the Congress regime onwards in some ways, you have a replacement of the sovereign citizen with the sovereign state. So it is a state that is sovereign, not the citizen. It's not we the people. We can talk about the meaning of the constitution also, but basically it's not we the people who is sovereign. We are made to believe it's the state that must be seen as sovereign, which is why then matters of security become more important than matters of sovereignty. It is a securitized state that we see. So anything that is seen as inimical to the interests of the state in conjunction with capital is then defined as disloyal, anti-state, seditious, and something to be placed beyond the pale of the social. But it could be Naxalites, they could be urban or rural Naxalites, they could be Muslims, they could be seditious Dalits, they could be queer women, queer men, queer people. So a lot of people who simply don't adhere to what the state imagines is a sovereignty that it has actually abducted from the people of India. So it is an abducted sovereignty the state has invested itself with, and that is something that we need to really sort of look at closely. And I think that whole thing in terms of how the state declares its own sovereignty, and again here I think it's a very involuted logic. I am sovereign and it's my security that is a definition of national security. And this again a bit of history is useful. I want to go back to the founding moment of the Republic, to the Constituent Assembly debates. And let us remember, it is exactly during that time that a transfer of populations is taking place through 47 up to almost till 52 from this side to that side. And one of the most important aspects of that transfer of population is the Recovery of Women Act, the Abduction and Recovery of Women Act, where Sikh and Hindu women abducted by Muslim men and Muslim women abducted by Sikh and Hindu men are to be restored to their respective countries. Now, of course, there was a very big sort of project that was put in place. A ministry was created under N. Gopalsamy Iyengar. A lot of women who were active in the nationalist and the anti-colonial movement were pressed into this service. And there are brigades of women that went back and forth fetching Hindu and Sikh women back from what had become Pakistan. And Pakistan had sent his own people to fetch people from India. Now, what was the logic of that? The logic was simply this: our women's wombs shouldn't bear their children. You see, and that whole thing had to do with that very famous book that Ritu Menon and Kamala Bhasin wrote, Borders and Boundaries. Borders and boundaries were actually being sort of constructed around women's wombs. Who is us, who is them, who decides? So just at the moment you had become India and Pakistan, you were doing this whole thing of drawing a securitized zone, which was actually a zone defined by sexuality also in a very fundamental way. Our women shouldn't bear their children. And of course, nobody asked the women what they wanted. If they had children by Muslim or Sikh husband or Muslim husbands or men, if they had got pregnant by Hindu men, no one asked them, do you want to keep your child? Where do you want to stay? And in fact, many of the women said, leave us alone. We don't want to go back because we don't know how our own families will take us, whether they'll accept us or not. So I think this whole thing of borders has a very long and interesting history, a very gendered history in fact. And feminist scholarship has brought this out in very many fundamental ways. And this is something that continues as we saw in any expression of nationalism. As we saw in the Manipur matter just a few months ago. This whole, the way in which women's bodies become markers of boundaries, community boundaries, national boundaries. And women who seek to dissent can also become upholders of these boundaries, as you saw with the women of Manipur, who had fought the Indian Army's own crimes against the women of Manipur very fiercely. Now defending the actions, sexual violence sort of perpetrated by Methi men. So it's a very bizarre situation and a very dangerous situation. But you see this concern with boundaries is made into such a emotional issue. The boundaries are not simply about lines or this side and that side, something that a British bureaucrat drew. No, they are also affective lines. They are lines about ownership, who belongs where, and everything is finally about our women, their women. And this whole love jihad feeds into it in a very fundamental way also today. No, so you see that happening. So that whole sovereignty question needs to be revisited also from a feminist point of view to communicate this anxiety about boundaries as also the anxiety about upholding a certain kind of Hindu masculinity, which is anxious and belligerent at the same time. It is anxious and belligerent, which you see in every expression of Hindu violence. It is about we are a great culture, but we allowed others to trample on us. The question of course is, if you are so great, why did people trample on you? I mean, that would be the question we wish to ask, right? But it's this whole anxiety about knowing that we have untouchability, we have a terrible culture of inequity, we don't have a broad democratic worldview that we have built. There is anxiety about all that, but not wanting to deal with that anxiety or any kind of discontent that comes from, such anxieties being sort of realized, then they then come out with this belligerent thing of Hindus have been hurt, Hindu sentiments are hurt, and so on. And this thing also, I think, is something the left hasn't addressed squarely. This whole gendered logic of the Indian nation or the Pakistani nation, this whole question of borders and boundaries also being sort of literally products, generative projects, no, they have to do about who can belong to a nation legitimately. And all the early fights about citizenship in the courts are about whose child, when was his child born, to who was his child born. So this whole thing about social reproduction is very central to national identity. And sorry to say, left scholarship hasn't engaged enough with the literature on social reproduction. Especially at this moment, it is very important. It is one thing to democratically protest these things, but it is also important to protest from within a larger critique of this kind of logic. And that's something that I think we need to also see ourselves doing as part of the left if we identify ourselves as such. The other thing about the question of the state is, what is it that we want to put in its place? And in practical terms, your state and my state have been in the forefront of this struggle. So states' rights, the rights of the state, federalism. I mean, the Tamil Nadu government has practically stopped using the word a unitary state. It says a federal state. The Tamil word it uses is a federal state. It has been replaced in all official documents. And recently they replaced the rupee sign. So they are now making a very big sort of visual demonstration of their opposition to the unitary Indian state. So federalism is obviously very much there on the cards, but there are also other less noticed but very important challenges to the Indian state that have quietly emerged, especially from amongst the Adivasis, I think. And one of the things that I think one should realize is the struggles around the 5th and 6th schedules of the constitution that have emerged, especially in Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand and in the northeast. There's been a big struggle about schedules themselves over the years, but basically the struggles are not only about fighting against the Indian army or democratic struggles for realizing everyday rights, but also about tribal autonomy. That is a word that has come to be used again and again in many of these contexts. Tribal autonomy in terms of access to resources, control over forests, but also the right to determine development on our own terms. We may not want modern development. You hear some Adivasis from Odisha saying. So I think this is something I think the progressive left is not able to wrap its head around fully. So I remember a leftist colleague of mine from Odisha saying, when they say Niyamgiri is their grandmother, they mean it in a symbolic sense. Of course, I said no, they do mean Niyamgiri is their grandmother. And that is a worldview we have to wrap our heads around. And I think that is something that tension you see in the writings of someone like Anuradha Gandhi, for example. She tried very hard to wrap her head around such arguments, but she also works from within a logic of progress and development, which doesn't know quite how to negotiate with such ways of looking at the world. To be fair to her, she was far more open than most people were to such formulations, while also insisting that not all such formulations that come from within a community context are necessarily egalitarian. That also she made clear in her writing. So there are some interesting things, precedents that are there in feminist writing from within some sections of the left also, which can help us to understand how do we then understand federalism itself. Not simply with what Tamil Nadu and Kerala governments are saying, CPM and DMK, but also these other spaces within India are saying. And I think some very important questions are coming from the Northeast. And one of the, Northeast we only think of conflict. But there has been some really rich work done by feminists from the Northeast. Dolly Kikon is one of them. She has been part of the Naga women's movement for human rights for a long time. And she's written this very important book called Living with Oil. Which is basically the discovery of oil in Assam, Nagaland. And how has that changed people's lives? What has happened to communities? How have people worked with that? How have they gone back and forth? How do they seek to turn things to their advantage? What outcomes are there? And what is the gendered outcome of all of this, considering it's an economy where women play a very important role in the local markets. So it's a very interesting study. So I think when we think of federalism, it would be also useful to go beyond available simple models that we have today, and also beyond the left's own understanding of national self-determination, which anyway hasn't been discussed further apart from broad sketches of what this could be. But when you look at what actually is happening on the ground, it's quite interesting. And apart from all of this, you have the Dalit response, which is noticeably different also. Because the Dalits have a claim on the unitary Indian state, which is an interesting irony. and contradiction also, because Ambedkar's own preference for a unitary state over a more federal state was because he felt that if you give more power to the provincial assemblies, as they were called then, they would necessarily come under the dominance of local caste elites, and Dalits would suffer, and Dalits need another point of negotiation or reference, the governor, and through the governor the federal government. Of course, we know that such reliance on the state is not going to play itself out in any favorable manner to the Dalits, but Dalits continue to work with that legacy. So their relationship to the unitary Indian state is far more favorable than the relationship of these other groups in some ways, though in a state like Tamil Nadu it is a little more equivocal. So you will have a leading political leader like Thirumavalavan, for example, throwing his full weight behind the federal demand. But at the same time, he would be the first to admit that the Atrocities Act wouldn't have been passed by a state government. So this is this is a contradiction, and we have to ask ourselves, how does this affect our understanding of federalism? And I say this because, at least in my state, whether it is a CPM or the various whatever ML groups still function, their understanding of federalism just echoes the Dravidian model. It does not offer anything more, anything less, except you have more or less assertions of Tamil pride and Tamil cultural exceptionalism. But you don't really have another way of sort of thinking through this from within the left, or learning from other examples. You don't have that. So what the left has done in Tamil Nadu at least, it has become an echo chamber of the Dravidian movement when it comes to federalism, sadly. It is not saying anything that is original or new or that can be picked up from other sources. So when you hear them defending the Dravidian model, so to speak, they are not looking at other criticisms that have emerged in the state itself of the Dravidian model, feminist criticisms, Dalit criticisms. Whatever you take, you must acknowledge that these exist, no? And they are not acknowledging the work done by their own party through the Tamil Nadu Untouchability Eradication Front, which meticulously carries out any number of fact-finding missions, which takes cases to court. It is one of the most, what shall I say, dynamic aspects of the CPM in my state. And sadly, that whatever they find on the ground is not made central to the left's understanding of social justice or federalism. So they continue to take refuge in the DMK's version, which I think is quite disastrous. The far left also does that, except that it subjects the DMK and the CPM also to critique. So this is the way it is. It's not like it's picking up from these various other, aspects and saying things. So that's something that also we need to keep in mind. And that brings me to the last point I wish to make, which is that in all of this, whether it's federalism, whether it is our understanding of the economy, the things that we can perhaps learn and expand the vocabulary of what we have, because I felt that the terms that are used in many of these left publications, while some of them are better worked out than others, they still lack that familiarity with detail, which then becomes transferred into a conceptual argument. And when by detail I mean a lot of comparative studies, because we are a subcontinent, we are not a nation so much in terms of differences. And the more you compare and the more you look at studies across the subcontinent, the richer your analysis is bound to be. But often it is theorized either from within Andhra, Telangana or Kerala or Chhattisgarh, but not in a way that one can pull out things. So which is why I feel it's very important that in our understanding of federalism also we bring in that geographical, historical differences that we have. And also what we share because we are part of this Indian Union. So and historical links that we might have. So that's something that is important. Lastly, one of the things that becomes, which we have set for ourselves as a goal is to fight Brahmanism, Manuvadi, whatever term we call it, as a logic of the, ideological logic of the present state. And the movement towards Hindu Rashtra will be realized by this kind of ideology, which is anyway not a new ideology as we all know. One form or the other it has always existed. But I think we still need to make a case for contemporary Brahmanism. What is it? Part of the exercise is of course to go back and look at Manusmriti and how it lives on. And Balgopal made this very important point that Manusmriti, it's not that the Hindu right wants to go back to the Manusmriti. Fact remains is that criminal jurisprudence, even of a modern kind, follows the logic of the Manu Dharma Shastra. And Ambedkar called it social habit, mental habitude he called it. So whether you read the Manu Dharma Shastra or not is irrelevant. Your attitudes are molded by ways of thinking about caste that are still with us today. Now we can also rethink that. I mean, historically there has been shifts, changes. What is still with us, what is not still with us, these are things that one can continuously debate. But I think Brahmanism in the present also has to be rethought in very careful, granular ways, I think, and how might one do that. One thing that I also miss in such descriptions of Brahmanism that we have is any engagement with the long traditions of anti-caste, anti-Brahmanical politics. And this has a very long history, It goes back to the 19th century. And in different parts of the country, again, different histories are there. So what does it mean to engage with these histories, with the groups that have emerged out of those histories and politics, and with their current revival across India, current revival in different ways across India? Because one tendency of the left has been to sort of wish it away as identity politics. One can still hold on to that view, but more labor perhaps needs to be put in to explain what exactly do we mean by identity politics, and also in an enabling sense. And what is creative about it, what needs to be reworked, re-understood and so on. But I find very little continuous or sustained engagement. And again in Tamil Nadu I see the left just mimicking Dravidian discourse in this regard. It hasn't done its own work. It doesn't really set out to understand this on its own basis. In fact, I suggested to some comrades, one way of doing it is to look at the history of modern Tamil Nadu to major events of violence against Dalits. It will be very interesting if you do that. To start with the 50s, and every decade has seen one major instance of violence, and not reduce it to atrocities, but see it in the light of wider political, social, economic changes that has brought about this sort of a response. So that would be an interesting way of thinking about Brahmanism also. How does it play out even in times when Brahmins are not the visible face of politics, or that they are not present in government, where reservation has meant sort of made the judiciary and the legislature more representative. But why does this logic persist? How might we think about it? That would be a good way also of thinking about some of these things. Is one idea that I've always been interested in pursuing, because it tells you something which other kinds of analysis might not tell you also. The other thing is, what might you challenge Brahmanism with? Is it enough to say constitutionalism? Is it enough to say socialism? Because I want to quote a line from Periyar from the 1940s. It's a very hilarious quote. This is part of a long dialogue that Periyar's Vidudalai weekly had with Janashakti. This was about the founding of the Dravidar Kazhagam and the Dravida Nadu demand. And this is before independence, and Janashakti speaks of the importance of anti-colonial resistance, that you can't sort of now come in with this Dravida Nadu demand and so on and so forth. You'll play right into British hands and whatever it is. So one of Periyar's younger colleagues, Gurusamy, he said, you have to beware of nationalism. It can entreat you with the power of Shaivism. It can charm and seduce you with the poetry of Vaishnavism. It can come at you with the zeal of people's movement and demand the thumb of the communist Ekalavya. It's a very powerful sort of description of Brahmanism, So I think that sort of way of thinking about these matters, how might you think of it in the present, and what would you challenge it with? So for Periyar and others, it was atheism, self-respect, anti-Brahmanism, consistently asking for larger non-Brahmin Dalit presence and so on. For Ambedkar, amongst many other things, it was opting out of Hinduism completely. So these have been things within the wider anti-caste movements, and Gail Omet has written about it in that book, Seeking Begumpura. What has been the demand of all these movements. So for the present, we seem to be working with the constitution for the most part, as perhaps an intermediate stage, or we work with very broad definitions of socialism, in which manner it has seldom been realized in histories, so to speak. So if you are working with constitutionalism, what else do we need to do? I think that is an important question, because I think the left has not really relied on the constitution from its own historical record. It's a latecomer to venerating the constitution. And I use the word veneration because that is what it has become. The constitution has become an icon now. We are not thinking of the Constituent Assembly debates. We are not looking at practical struggles to do with the law. Because if you do that, then you will have to look at what anti-caste groups have done, what trade unions have done, what women's groups have done. Because these are the groups that work with the law in an everyday sense. So what has that meant? Or civil rights groups have done. And I think those lessons are very important. And what do they help us to ask about the law, about constitutional mandates? And for the present day context, if you want to say anything meaningful about the constitution, we have to have something meaningful to say about the uniform civil code, for example. 3 states have passed it right now, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh. One more state, Haryana, Uttarakhand. 4 states have passed. I mean, this is an unprecedented violence. But how does one think about it? Because we have very little juridical precedence from our side to counter it, because we are not looking at what feminists have done. There's been a 4-decade conversation on the civil code amongst feminists, and not one of those debates figures in the public consciousness. There's been so much work with the law against communal violence and sexual violence after Gujarat. In fact, women's groups brought together an international commission to look at what happened in Gujarat, headed by Rhonda Copeland, who went to Serbia at that time. So none of these are part of public memory or public thinking about these matters. So this engagement with the constitution should go beyond what is there, and how might we think about it, where else can we learn from and pick up ideas from, is also something that I think are very important things. Because otherwise what, and I'll end with this, what you find happening is, if we don't constantly renew our own understanding, drawing from other struggles or from challenges that have been meted out to the left, is that whether it is the parliamentary left or the far left or anti-caste movements like the Dravidian movement, they put forth an official understanding, which can be very detrimental in many ways, because they create official solutions also. And official solutions governmentalize issues, right? They bring it within the purview of governance. So if you look at gender, for example, my state does it with a kind of welfareism, dealing with giving women any number of putting them with welfare schemes. Not that these are not consequential. They also indicate the levels of poverty and inequality that we still have. But your state has done it with what the J. Devika calls governmental feminism, through Kutubashri and various other structures. So, and with Dalits also, no, Dalits then become only symbols of state welfare, whether it's reservation, whether it is the condescending justice that they are willing to deliver sometimes if it suits them. So, but not as people who have an entitled claim on the state because of their struggles and rights. So how do you get beyond these government categories? And I think Tamil Nadu and Kerala have become very adept at creating this sense that there is a way in which these governments have addressed and successfully resolved these issues. And I think that is something as dangerous as saying that these issues don't matter, because we have not resolved them. We may have done some very important historical moves in the past, but what has happened to the present? What about internal critiques? Where else do you think of these matters? I think all these are things that we still need to look at. So when I think of Hindu communalism and the left, I would really like to think of this subject not in terms of what the left has failed to do, but what else could the left do? Because the language of failure is not enabling to anybody. And we still want to think of a broad, democratic, sort of with distributive justice at its center in some ways, whether we call it socialism or we call it something else, something that's not capitalist. So I think these are important questions for us, how we think of neoliberalism, how we think of Brahmanism, the Indian state, a relationship to the constitution, and our understanding of the left's own historical engagement with all these issues. And by the left I mean different shades but also different geographies. I think first of all that analytical lens has to shift from the nation to different geographies. I won't even say regions. Regions is still very condescending. We are not a region. Each of us is a unit, historical unit in ourselves, in our own right. And we may share some things with each other also that are equally important than what we share with this national whole. So, and I do think Tamil Nadu and Kerala have a lot of things historically that tie us together. And also because of the way our social movements and political movements have developed, we have also sort of come to a certain impasse right now, which our governments are desperately trying to cross over. So in that context, I think it's very useful to think beyond categories that we already have. Thank you very much.